I'm gonna talk about Impressionism for a second, and then we'll take a short break and hop into that third section there, industrialization in the West. Um, let's
Are you
see
going to
here.
talk about imperialism?
Yes, yes, definitely. So that's where we're building up to,
Mm-hmm.
like 1898, 1899, 1900 is when
Mm-hmm.
America enters the real imperial game. The European countries are like, they've been doing that for a while. America's just
Mm-hmm.
catching up now, though. So colonization, imperialism is one of these
Mm-hmm.
huge shifts that happens kind of globally in
Mm-hmm.
different speeds in different parts of the world. But
Mm-hmm.
it's all kind of this shift in the way humanity's operating. So this is like really where globalization starts to take form and come in. The same way with art starts to change very dramatically at this point, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
different types of art, but if we're talking about European art, you're like, all right, well, there's the stuff from like, I don't know, like 2000 years ago, or like the late Roman period that's, frescoes and stuff. And okay, there's paintings and they did sculptures. And then, you get all the way up to the Renaissance. It's like, all right, well, they're just the kind of better versions of that, but they're always trying to capture realism. They're always trying to bring image to life for people that have literally no other way to capture image. They cannot press a button on anything. They can't manufacture a replica of real life
Mm-hmm.
imagery. So the like, and that's why like the kind of high point of the Renaissance. It's some of the paintings and the sculptures are praised because they're like, wow, they get very like, the technique gets really developed. Um, and kind of the height of that moving into romanticism is still very like, it just kind of gets better and better. Rembrandt and David and those guys. Um, but then towards the end of the 19th century, towards like the 1870s, 1880s, artists, particularly in Paris, but not just Paris, but Paris is kind of the birthplace of Impressionism, which is associated with like, here, I'll click on this picture here. There we go. I love this. This is Claude Monet. He's got a whole series of these, and this is Impressionism. Now this is a this is one of my favorites. Let me.
By the art style of it or something, or
I don't know why I like those ones so much. Let me, yeah, because let me show you guys another Monet that you'll be probably much more familiar with, which would be something like this, Water
and the
Lilies,
other one.
and
Okay, that is pretty.
yeah. Oh, and so this is Van Gogh. We'll pause on that because he's like next. He's like the turning point of Impressionism into something else.
Mm-hmm.
So Impressionists are very like, it like, this is beautiful. It's like, okay, this is this beautiful sunscape, but it doesn't look like technically super proficient, right? It doesn't look like that doesn't look like reality, but it evokes a feeling about that beach place, image that is
Mm-hmm.
connects you to reality. So they're going, well, cameras are a thing now. We can take photos of people. Like maybe making things as realistic as possible is not the highest form of art. Maybe we can just play with color and like pointillism. So most of these, especially Monet, it's like very detailed dots that they paint by. So if you get up close to one of these, which we've got some at the Getty, but if you go to other museums, the Louvre in Paris obviously has a lot. There's an impressionism museum there, the Museum d'Orsay. There's so many in Paris, but you get up close to them, you can't tell what you're looking at because it's all dots. It's like looking at a very pixelated picture. But then stepping far back, you kind of see the big picture. And that's kind of, I think that's kind of one of the, not points, but like themes of Impressionism. And so it's beauty, it's nature, it's about, you know, it's kind of in the romanticism, in the romantic era, like the feeling of it all.
Yes.
The reason I like, okay, so that's a famous, you know, water lilies. People love that. I love this one that is much more kind of dark and depressing, I think, because it it it's saying a little bit more than the water lilies are to me. Knowing that this was what is Impressionism and that this guy also did a lot of like ponds and scenery and like flowers. What do you notice that's different about this picture? Like, okay, it's on water like a pond, but it's not a pond, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what
Like
are we looking at?
like an industrial, like where I don't know. To me, it looks like an industrial area.
Yes, yes. Like the smokestacks in the back
Smoke.
here and stuff.
Looks
Yeah.
like certain parts of Tacoma waterfront, actually.
Yeah, which is like, oh, this guy that paints beauty and nature is painting this like the colors are so beautiful and it's the soft,
Right.
you know, it's the soft style that he does. But you're like,
So is that
oh,
like
this is
the
like a
evening?
dystopic looking picture of like
Mhm.
industry coming and just kind of ruining nature. Like,
Yeah.
I can see it. Yeah, I can kind of
Yeah.
see if you look really closely in the background.
Well,
Well, I
What's
can
up
see
back
like
here?
the sunset, so it's definitely towards the evening,
yeah,
well,
perhaps, maybe.
not only
yeah.
that, for me, it look it's like the farmers are trying to catch probably their dinner, and then you have the industrial part in the back that
Yeah,
is
these big
not
ships and
looking.
stuff back
Yeah.
here and the smokestacks.
Yep.
So and Monet's not the only one. Pissarro, um, uh, Mary Cassatt, Manet or Manette, which is so close to Monet, I get that confused. Those are like you know the masters, the impressionists, and this is kind of like the new style now. But it was, you know, people thought it was horrible at first. They thought it was the worst thing in the world. That's usually how art gets criticized, and then eventually it came to set the standard. But then somebody like Vincent van Gogh, who you guys can correct me if I'm wrong on this or like fact check me. I don't want to be on Wayfair. I heard they sell children in their cabinets.
Yes, I've heard about that.
Wait, what?
They're
That's all-
saying that it's the cabinet names are like the kids who are being human trafficked.
in the cabinets, right? Like they're
Yes,
getting
in the
shipped.
cabinets.
Yeah, it's
So
crazy.
like if you buy the Madison cabinet, it's supposed to be named after that human trafficked child or whatever. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I've heard about that about Wayfair. I was just like, what?
And also the website always has, any commercials always has a catchy tune. I'm being honest. But come on, I'm not the only one who agrees with that. I'm not the only one.
Wait, what?
No, besides, you know, Wayfair has a commercial. They always have that catchy tune.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, come on, that's actually not addicting. Am I the only one, or because I think it's kind of,
I don't see commercials usually,
never mind.
unless they're like
Instagram
web
stuff.
commercials, which are not, you know, my favorite. So here, just looking at this is a self-portrait of Van Gogh. He's got quite a few. Somebody can fact check me and tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe he didn't sell a painting in his lifetime. Like he died of failure. Like people did not think he was a good artist. You know, some people did, and I think it was his sister actually who was like his biggest like patron supporter and like promoted his work after he died in galleries and got him really recognized, which to most people today is like, oh, Vincent van Gogh is one of the most brilliant painters in the world and we love his paint. And if you look at like this scene here, this doesn't look super different from an impressionist painting, but like there's more detail. The colors are a little bit more harsh. They're a little bit more striking. They're a little bit more in your face. And then you get to something like this, The Starry Night, which is like, uh, you know, one of, geez, it's just getting worse.
Like that one.
Yeah, I love this one too. This is a
Mhm.
popular one. It's so cool looking, and we kind of take it for granted because you see the stuff on shirts and coffee mugs, and you know, people making copies of it and imitating it, and so it's like, well, yeah, that's just, of course, that's around. But in 1900 or 1906 or whatever, no, 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 no. This was like people thought this was weird and crazy, and that Van Gogh
Mhm.
was crazy, and he probably was a little crazy because most artists are crazy to make stuff like this and be like, what? I don't care. Like, you think it's ugly? Screw you. I think you're ugly. Like I like what I like. No, you're usually a little bit nuts to do, you know, to live like that. Artists kind of have to be if they're going to be a Van Gogh and not a Thomas Kincaid. And I don't
Mhm.
want to rip Kincaid. He had a hard road, and I feel, you know, I just feel for him. But if you guys don't know Thomas, you'll recognize it. It's all like he's the artist of light. So it's like, you know, these, which
Mhm.
looks, I mean, it's pretty, but this is not like, I don't feel like that's as gutsy as that or that. Like, that's a lot. You're challenging people to like something there. And so this is like a very like tripped, like, did you eat some mushrooms in the forest before you
Right.
painted this? Like, whoa, dude, this is trippy and just kind of surreal and weird, but
I
also
like it though
intriguing.
too because it's like, um, you know, this is what's going on in the minds of a lot of people,
Yeah.
like that kind of warped. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Not sense of humor, but just their reality.
Yeah, how we read the world, how our
Yeah.
senses perceive it. You know, we
Mhm.
make the foolish assumption to think that everybody senses and perceives and even experiences the world the same way we do. That
Mhm.
Well,
what
the
tastes like
problem,
steak to me tastes like steak to you, but you know,
Professor,
how do I know that? Yeah.
Van Gogh had a psychological, he was psychotic, in and out of mental institution.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So a lot of people didn't understand his work because they just understood and knew his medical problems or psychotic problems. But he actually committed. He at one time he ate his left ear.
He cut it off,
Um,
right?
yep,
Wait, he ate his left ear, or he cut off his left ear, or
cut
he
it
ate
and
it?
ate his left ear.
I didn't know he
Um,
ate it.
Like,
Oh,
yes,
do you?
yes.
Aren't ears hard to eat? I'm like,
I don't
seriously.
know.
Like,
Um,
I see
but
people like get their
he
ears ripped
was
off.
he was in and out of the hospital, and he did commit suicide. So he shot himself with the revolver.
yeah.
Wow.
That's
It's
after I think people knew about him after the fact, and that's how he got he's world famous right now. Everybody knows about him is because of his psychiatric. He expressed what he was feeling, obviously, and that's why a
yeah.
lot of people can relate to some of these paintings because they're
Yeah.
amazing. You know.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot of people even, you know, suggest, and this is kind of becoming more of a pursuit that, like, so psychohistory is such a thing, like to look back on history through the lens of psychology, and to, you know, read people kind of through some interpretive lenses that we have now that we did not have back then. And clearly in the 19th century, anybody that had any problem, they just called them hysterical and put them in a home or an institution, or, you know, like floated them out on an iceberg, you know, like it was not a very kind society, and it was not a very understanding society because everybody's worlds they're much smaller. So you might have one totally weird guy like Van Gogh in your town. But nowadays in the 20th century, we realized like, well, there's a lot of Van Goghs, like maybe not quite that
Well,
brilliant
and
in
there's
their
like,
stuff, but
did
like
you
there's a lot of people that have that kind of a hard time living in the normal world and don't perceive it the same way, but are brilliant people.
like the joke? I like the Joker. If I don't know if you
Yeah.
guys saw that movie.
Oh, I
I-
seen it. It was
That was yeah,
sad.
So
really. There's a
good.
lot of people like that.
Yes. And
I had empathy for him.
yeah, I did too. I mean, God, that movie
Yeah.
was brilliant. But yeah, like Van Gogh. So some people have gone back and suggested like, oh, Van Gogh was probably almost certainly on the autistic spectrum. Like
Oh yeah.
at some point you're like, that makes sense. I could definitely see that. That makes sense. Just even just a handful of things we just said about him. It's like, okay, not that autistic people chop off their ears and eat them. That's mental disease. But
Okay, that's
but when you
messed
have
up.
when you're on the spectrum and experience a life of kind of abuse or trauma, or like it's not well for you, I think you're susceptible to develop mental disease that is not autism, but is kind of usually paves a pathway for it. So he kind of is just his own thing right here around the turn of the century. Obviously he wouldn't have done that probably without the Impressionists.
All right.
He's a step of them, but he's not just copying them. And so for me, and I think kind of in art, like in the arc of art, it's like Van Gogh kind of peaks out at the top of what Impressionism could be, or kind of how it thought of itself. And then what comes next is Fauvism, which is like these kinds of colors.
So what's the significance of art in history? I mean, I understand, but like, what in your terms, like, what is it going to be on the test?
Okay, so I'll have a couple conceptual questions about this. Not maybe challenging you on the like what's going to follow what, but I feel like for me, and I mean, I grew up I didn't grow up on the right side of the tracks, and I didn't spend any time going to art museums or doing anything like that. So it's a very foreign thing for me. And I just kind of was like, whatever. Like, I thought modern art was just kind of weird and stupid. And like the classical stuff made sense to me. But then even this stuff, I'm like, yeah, okay, I get it. What's so special about that? But actually being able to like set those paintings or this kind of progression of art in cultural moments as kind of culture is changing for visual people and for artists in general, I think, but for our visual kind of conceptual ideas of things, I find that very helpful because now not only does the differences and why they're different make some sense to me, but also now seeing those differences, and it's not hard to remember Impressionism. Like, okay, that's what those are, the lilies. I've heard of Monet. Like, even I heard of Monet. I grew up in the slums and I heard of Monet. I didn't know who it was, but once I put two and two together, I'm like, okay, that's him. He does that style. That's called Impressionism. And then,
Like,
everybody's
what
seen a
about,
Van Gogh.
what about what's his name? Bukowski. Charles Bukowski.
I'm not as versed in Bukowski.
Bukowski.
I don't know. Can you
Charles
fill us in?
Bukowski. His
I like art, but I
His
never heard
work.
of many artists before. Just to be honest.
Yeah, no, I believe
No,
me. I never had before college either.
It's Bukowski. Charles.
Charles Bukowski. Here, I'm gonna pop him.
Only artist I heard does a lot of
Definitely.
self-portraits of herself. And
Oh,
I'm being off topic.
yeah,
and
right there, Charles Bukowski.
I'll look at
Definitely.
this. I'll come back to him. I'll look at that.
Yeah, for sure.
I'll pick up the pace a little bit here. We don't actually have a ton more to go.
Okay, cool.
This guy is another one of those links, and you'd probably, if you recognized him, it might be something like this, which I think is in the MoMA Museum in New York. Or
That looks like some kindergarten work.
totally. And
it
then
kind of does. I'm not being mean. It kind of does.
so if this is now art, and it's like, well, that's what's kind of avant-garde, cutting edge. And then people like Van Gogh come and kind of shake that up and challenge it more. Well, the Fauvism, these folks that are emerging as Impressionism is falling out of fashion, are doing things in these kind of like bold colors, strange abstract human forms like that. So this is Henri Matisse, and he's probably the most famous of these types of artists. And so this is a famous one for him. What is this? I'll open that one, and then there's one other one.
That's really interesting.
I don't see it. Yeah. So here, I'll close. I got a lot of tabs open here.
Professor.
Yeah.
Who was the one that you mentioned after Van Gogh? Already on the bottom.
Henri Matisse. Yeah. Where is his? I had his.
Matisse. Okay.
Yeah. Henri Matisse, A Beast on the Loose. So, and this is like clearly
wow.
not trying to capture.
That's really interesting. What the?
You're right. You're like, what am I even looking at? Wait, huh? How are they connected or touching? This is strange. And clearly, his point is not to make a super lifelike representation of a human or 5 humans dancing. Or if it is, he did a bad job. This is more like playing with body and motion and form and just kind of like, you know, breaking more rules, which is kind of like how art moves on. So they're breaking rules. Henri Matisse is, you know, he's doing stuff like this. So think about this, which does look like a kindergartner could do that, right? But kindergartners don't usually do a great job at like making pretty great color palettes. Out of like raw materials nonetheless usually, and then having like some symmetry to what they're doing. It's asymmetrical, but you can tell like, well, there's design and purpose in here, and it's kind of nice to look at. But in 1905, I think is when this came out. Like that's weird art, but it's also very engaging and intriguing. But it's strange for the time.
Well, they call it like aesthetics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and then it just gets weirder, right? So this is where we get Picasso, and Picasso comes in, and this is like right before the Civil War, I mean World War One. This is like right before World War One. He is going to debut at like really have his big American debut at the Armory Show in New York. Is this famous show? It's kind of the place of modern dance was born there too, with a freestyle, non-taught dancer named Isadora Duncan, I think is her name.
Yeah.
Yeah, you familiar with her?
Yeah.
Isadora.
Tell us about her a minute while I look for the image I want here.
Well, I mean, just like as a dancer, when we do a lot of modern dance, we actually look at a lot of pieces from like Picasso's time era, kind of.
Yeah.
And then so it's just like, I don't know how to explain it, but it's the way his artwork is really involved in the different style of dance, which is really interesting.
Yeah. So you pair that, right? Like his kind of weird paintings about bodies and his thing is, and he's not the only person to do this. There are other people beginning to do this right when he is, but this is Cubism. So that's the next one is like, well, then there's Fauvism and then there's Cubism, which is looking at objects from multiple angles at the same time. So this is like, Picasso had actually painted this, I think in 1907, but it doesn't get, I don't think this gets unveiled there. I think it gets unveiled in 1913, which is shocking because this is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is the whores of Avignon. Prostitutes. It's like,
Wow.
oh, those are naked prostitutes. That's not usually the subject of high cultured art. Like, what? And they're weird and terrifying looking, right? Like, there's like an African mask on one of them, and all these like non-European elements here, right? There's like a lot of global influence going on here. And if you think about what it means to transition from being a pre-industrial society or person or thinker into a post-industrial one, looking at objects or events in history or opinions or kind of value systems from multiple angles at one time or all together is kind of what we have to do in the world to make sense of stuff now, because just a one-dimensional flat view of things is so inadequate to explain how much depth there is in the world that we know of, just, you know, cross-culturally, how much we're aware of historically, how much knowledge we know even exists in the world. It's like, well, if I want to feel like settled on something, I have to kind of come at it from all these different points of view. People didn't used to think that way. Not like, oh, dumb people didn't used to think that way. Like, nobody thought that way. There were not, Europe wasn't filled with Christians that were like, you know, maybe if we go over and talk to the Turks, or, you know, we send some emissaries to Egypt and open up some dialogue and actually try to figure out why they're, you know, organized the way they are. And maybe if we kind of inquire about their religion more and open up some theological dialogues, like, that could be productive, and we could actually find some more truth in that between ourselves. No, there's nobody in Europe thinking that. They're all like, fucking yeah, let's kill them. Get the crusades going on. The Turks are the same way, though. I mean, like, everybody's that way. They're not thinking about, like, trying to view the world from other points of view the way we're forced to do now. Like, we're just forced to have to take in other people's points of view much more than would probably naturally do. Humans didn't used to do that. But at the time that the world's getting crazy, it's right before World War One. Like, it's right before like the world's just going to blow up and kind of never come down from the mania, to be honest. That this is like matching up with modern dance, and it's like, well, they're just ripping all the rules off at this point. Like, this is so far away from classical, you know, what would be considered classical art in the Romantic period. It's almost unrecognizable, but that's in like a 50-year window that art just transitioned like that, 40-year window maybe, and modern dance going with it. But then the war hits, and the war changes everything. It changes for people because you can't unknow some of those things. You can't unknow, like, the destructive power that humans have now. You can't unknow all of the, you know, things about other cultures that you even encountered. And I want to do a little bit more research on this. I have a feeling some of you guys might pick this as a project, but, you know, infectious disease. I was talking on, you know, I was telling you guys about that new app, Stereo, which has been really fun. And if any of you want to hop on there.
I saw you.
Did you get on? I'm going to get on tomorrow
like,
afternoon from like 1 to 5 or 6, actually. I'm going to be on for a while. So yeah, hop on there. Let's talk. It would be fun. I've had all kinds of great conversations on there, but I've had a lot of good ones about history. And yeah, just the like, so I want to do a little bit more research on this, but we are more interested in infectious disease than we were 5 years ago. Everybody is. But that's certainly been reflected in the student body in my classes. Kind of the same way, like, it's actually easier. I know it can still be a bit of a snoozer to work through communism as an idea, but everybody's a lot more interested in it now than they were 5 or 10 years ago, because it's a weaponized word, and, you know, that's used a lot, and it's got a complicated idea. So there's this, we want to know more about this. So I'm interested in infectious disease. I've taught about the Spanish flu since I started teaching. My understanding of it's grown. And then my understanding in the last year has just changed, because I got to experience elements of that to go, I never thought about this. And then I don't know if you've seen this, but there's like historic pictures of people like with bandanas on, and they're like, you know, put your damn mask on. Like, you can't come into town without your mask. Like, oh, well, we've been doing this for 100 years. We didn't learn jack shit. Like, why haven't we been talking about this? Why didn't I know about some of these elements of the Spanish flu to talk about in history class? Because they could have really helped us right now, right? Not like my class would have saved America, but if history classes broadly in America had talked about that in a more important and kind of like clear way, I think we would have had a better we'd be a little bit more mentally prepared for even something like a global pandemic. But in
Right.
that, some students have, you know, I've seen stuff where they think that the Spanish flu, it didn't come from Spain. It was, I feel like I'm gonna definitely
It
get
started
whatever I
like
say wrong.
thinking like the ships, the
Well, yeah, it traveled
Navy
via
ships,
the
yeah.
ships, right? Like
but
all
it
these
didn't come from
people.
Spain.
It
Yeah.
came from kind of where viruses come from, like the AIDS virus.
Yeah.
The edge of the jungle where animal diseases are mutating to be able to like infect humans. It's a
Mhm.
horrible thing. But that doesn't happen in like the suburbs. It doesn't happen in the middle of New York City. It happens way out in the jungle, usually where there are very few humans ever. But as industrialization keeps pushing those borders in, humans come into closer and closer proximity with kind of like not the edge of the frontier, but kind of the heartland of wilderness. And you can get bit by animals, but people also eat animals, right? Like bats or monkeys and stuff that I'm like, I don't think I'd want to eat that, but people do. And those materials are now going to get shipped around the world, and those workers are going to be transmitting the things that they've contracted, and that's going to spread a lot faster around
Yeah,
the world
like
than
the-
the Black Death did, or the bubonic
Yeah,
plague.
the plague.
Yeah.
Well,
And-
yeah, like they say the bat droppings in those factories, those farms and stuff in China is like how it really got, COVID-19 got
Yeah, I've seen some of that
Started.
stuff too. And I watched
Okay.
one thing, maybe it was on Netflix. It was like,
Oy.
it was very helpful. It was like a kind of a timeline breaking down of like how everything happened.
I think it
But
was
they were
on
nailing it
2020.
down way more concretely than I
Yeah.
felt like comfortable with. They're like, well, on, on like
I
December
think that was
12th,
2020.
on,
Are you guys talking
no,
about that
this was like on
movie that-
December 12th, a man ate, he bought a bat from this market. And then, he gave it, I'm like, dude, I don't think we've honed it in that we should be talking that concretely. Like we don't have a silver bullet on knowing what that is.
Are you guys talking about that movie where like a big that's kind of like
No,
what's kind
not
of happening like right now?
that
I forgot
the
the movie
propaganda
called.
movie, right?
I think that's what it's called. It's kind of like what's happening right now. Like people are dying just from this for some reason. Or sorry if I'm explaining this wrong, because when you guys were talking about the whole coronavirus thing, it kind of reminded me of that movie we saw. I saw before. Well,
What,
I saw before.
Contagion?
I think I don't remember. I've seen it twice when I was in health. And also, while I was in health class, I forgot what it's called, but it's kind of similar to the coronavirus we are dealing right now. If you kind of think about it.
What's that noise?
Yeah, can you guys mute
Can
yourselves
someone
if
mute
you're
that
not
out?
talking? Here, I'm gonna mute everybody and then just unmute yourselves when you want to talk. Wait, how do I mute everybody? This thing's
But yeah,
memorized.
Bill Gates was talking about. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I haven't muted everybody yet because I didn't find the thing. Darn it. I muted myself.
Under your task or your three dots, I think, as a host.
I've got, yeah, here, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second because I can't see it moved all the things around. It was like a little floating bar. Okay, let me see here. I'm into audio, participants. Boom. Mute all. There we go. Okay, now whoever was talking or wants to talk, go ahead and unmute yourself, and we'll just
Okay.
have two mics on at a time.
I was saying like Bill Gates was on TED Talk about 4 years ago, or 5, 6, maybe 6 years ago, speaking about a global pandemic and his concerns. He was actually speaking just like about like how it is now. Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
no,
yeah.
I'm sorry. The screen, like.
Oh, yeah. I'm projecting my screen. Sorry.
okay.
I'm trying to get images up while you're talking.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's been talking about global pandemics
Mhm.
for a while now, right? Because that clip's like 5 or 6 years old.
Yep.
So like what did the movie you were watching say about that?
Who? The other girl?
Oh yeah, well I don't know. I was just like whatever
Yeah, the
kind
other
of
girl was, I
film you guys
forgot
were
her name.
referencing,
Angela
because
was talking.
yeah, because I've heard crazy things, and there's so many conspiracy theories out there.
Well, I was watching like an actual documentary on 2020 on the timeline on how it gone on. So like Trump, they knew like way back from like early as January what was going on, but he just decided not say like acknowledge it, but just give it any credibility, because the CDC was ready to actually go to China and to start to check out what was going on. From the documentary that I was watching, it like gave it like a narrow, like from the first patient in Washington State who had presented these symptoms. I think he was like no more than like 30 something, 37 or so. He just came back from China. He was like coming up with respiratory issues, and they contacted the CDC, and the head of the CDC, I think, was it Redford, or what's his name? Robert, is it Redford? They let Trump advise him of what was going on, and he basically decided not to act on it. And
that was what I
Mhm.
think what you're referring to is that the Bob Woodward clip.
Mhm.
Who, if you guys aren't familiar with him, he's the journalist that broke the Watergate story that forced Richard Nixon to resign, and he's interviewed and written a book about every president since then. And so
Mhm.
he got Trump to do one. It's called Fear, and it just came out a little earlier this year. I have it on
I haven't
Audible,
seen
but I
that.
haven't listened to it yet. I'm sure it's going to be good. He's a fantastic writer. But he released an audio clip of the president back in like January saying like it's very bad, it's going to kill lots of people, like totally acknowledging how serious it was.
Yeah.
And then downplaying it. And now he's saying I never said that, and accused, literally yesterday he accused Biden at that town hall. He said,
you were watching that too on
where the person, he's like, well, why didn't you do anything about a mandatory like nationwide mask mandate? Well, why didn't Biden do it? He said, they said if the Democrats get power, they're going to do it. And people were just looking at him like, what? Like, Biden can't mandate anything.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. Like, country was like so focused on what was going, with Kobe Bryant, the Super Bowl and stuff, that they didn't realize that there was a huge respiratory disease that was going on, mysterious one happening in China. And like, if you look back on your, just like when you're like watching something, how you're on your phone, and then like the news will pop up.
Yeah.
And like there are like literally clippings from like January, from like December of like the mysterious infectious disease that was popping up on your feed, but people were just not paying attention.
Well, and here's the problem too, right? Like we've probably gotten other news feeds like that turned out to not be anything too. So it's like, well, I don't just react to every news story. I mean, you'd go crazy if you did, because there's so many of them turn out to be different than we expected, not true, or is misinformation. I'll say this about Bill Gates, because on Stereo, it's interesting because definitely nobody's parents are on that app, and most people's friends aren't even on that app because it's like 2.5 weeks old. But people are honest on it because it's just conversation, and there's not even like a written record of what you're saying. So I've talked to some people about conspiracy theories on there, and last week a guy was trying to tell me that he thought George Floyd wasn't dead, and that was all a fake conspiracy.
Oh wow!
And then like I've heard the one about Bill Gates, but so this is where it's like, okay, having a little bit broader of knowledge about the situation will help us not get sucked up by the propaganda videos that go out from either side that want you to do something or believe something.
Right.
Where it's like, all right, well, let me just look at some facts here. Okay, you look back over at like Forbes magazine or The Economist or something back there. You can look at like, just the records of the Gates, institution or whatever, the Gates Foundation. And like
Bill and Melinda.
before coronavirus, he had already signed off his entire fortune to charity. Like when he dies, it's all going there. Like that's crazy. There are not billionaires, multi-billionaires. There's not a lot of multi-billionaires doing that with their money. So to me, I'm like, oh, he kind of was like, I'm done with the computer thing. I'm out. I'm retired from that. But he's one of the richest people in the world, and like he travels the world trying to like take care of problems. Like, but his big thing, even before an infectious disease, was like, there's thousands of people that die every month from diarrhea because they don't have clean water. Like,
right? Yes.
This should not be a true fact about the world we live in right now. There's no reason for that to be true. Like, we definitely have the resources and power and means to fix that for pretty much everybody anywhere we are. But clearly, like business driving the world and the world economy and all the money and resources, that's not a high priority. That's usually doesn't ever happen with businesses. That's why like somebody like Bill Gates is like, oh, that's pretty rare. And so, yeah, he's been talking about infectious disease for a long time, but a lot of other global health problems that I'm like, I wasn't even aware that was a thing, or I didn't know that was still going on, or I didn't know the statistics were that bad. So to me, I'm like, yeah, okay, a guy who donated hundreds of billions of dollars to give away, he already is like pretty much one of the most powerful people in the world.
Right. Definitely.
I don't think he's not trying to like manipulate. Geez, he owned Microsoft. If he wanted to manipulate us, he could have just done it with that. Like,
correct.
It's everywhere, right? Like, I don't think that's what's going on here.
Well, what makes me mad, and I'll finish this and then I let you like go on. But what makes me mad is that Trump, George Bush, he read the book about a pandemic, and he signed different things into what do you call it, the pandemic playbook, in case something like this should happen in the future. And then Obama like continued on with it, and he handed that book to Trump. And the fact that he just got rid of it, just
slashed it, fired everybody. You're fired.
Yeah.
I know. It's like, well, there are real life consequences for electing a narcissistic 2-year-old. Like, people are going to die. Maybe it's not because he started a nuclear war. Maybe he's going to kill. Like, we have more deaths than any country. Like, we make up 5% of the world's population. Canada had 0 deaths yesterday from COVID.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we're still like India is catching up with us now, but they've got over 1 billion people, and a lot of them live in slums and have never even seen a doctor. So we should be aware, like, oh, this is not good. If we're rating ourselves on like global rankings, this is really bad, but we're kind of sucked up in the moment and the drama of it all right now. Okay, well, okay. Great thoughts on that. I'm going to do this in 2 minutes now and just kind of turn the corner on that. So we were talking about art. We were talking about kind of the progression of that, but that led into talking about the changes in the world and the way people think about the world, because the way we think about the world, the way we see things, the way we see ourselves, what we think about art, what we think about rules about those things, what we think about image, they're actually always changing, especially as new technologies come out. And so those new technologies are reflected in these changes of art. And I think that World War II and then the Spanish flu, and mind you, 20 million people at least died in World War I. And then as the war's wrapping up, and it's the worst war the world has ever seen by a long shot. We know there's a second world war with an even crazier guy than Trump, probably, named Hitler. And we know that's coming. So we usually kind of downplay World War One, and we're like, man, the footage is kind of grainy, and that just seems so far back then. And there's another one coming that there's, you know, more. They've got more interesting shows on the History Channel on that than World War One. But man, if we don't know there's another World War coming, this is the worst thing anybody's ever experienced. And as it's wrapping up, you get the first real globally experienced pandemic where like it's a shockwave through the whole world that goes quickly because of globalization and technology. So you have another 20 million people die, and it's a weird flu because it attacks like young adults who are also a big part of the population that got decimated in the war. So this is madness. I mean, people break. People come back from World War One talking about shell shock, and you can watch a video of like guys, they just literally can't hold they can't hold their hands. They can't hold anything together. They can't hold a glass of water for like the rest of their lives. They're totally just broken. But we don't know how to talk about PTSD yet. Like that's not even a concept anybody's going to think of for another 30 or 40 years. But artists kind of know how to get at that. And so the reason I'm taking time to do this is because I think art it's either a disconnected subject that we can kind of enjoy at a visceral, you know, like you were saying, aesthetic level, or it's just kind of like distant and not really meaningful or confusing or boring. I'm not trying to get everybody to become art lovers. I want everybody to know, like, just like, I don't really care if you like swing music or not. I love swing music. Maybe even more than that, though. I love like clarinet jazz music from like the 1920s, the period we're talking about right now in this moment. I don't care if you guys don't like that. I just want you to know when that music was, you know, when it was when, right? Like just kind of the way we know, oh, that's the 80s, that's the 90s, that's the 70s. We get much further, you know, past our parents and don't know. So just even with like art and art genres and kind of famous artists, it's like, I just want you to be able to place them in context with everything, because they're usually saying deeper truths than a lot of the rest of society at that moment, but they're always being ignored until after the fact, kind of like Van Gogh. It's like, well, you guys should have probably like heard him out a little bit before he killed himself. Like it doesn't make any sense to like, well, okay, I'm going to do this fast. So I'm sharing, you guys can see this pipe, right? Okay. So this is, does anybody speak French in here?
Let's see, Nespasu. No, I don't know how to say that.
I think it's,
I can hardly read cursive, so
this is kind of a blurry photo. Let me go back to a different one. This is a famous picture. This is in 1929, so it's a little bit later in terms of.
I just know what it means. I don't know how to say it.
Cicines pas pipe. This is not a pipe. That's what it means in French, right? Which you're like, yes, it is. It's a pipe. But this is where people are at in the 1920s after World War One. They're like, no, everything's relative. Language is bendable. Our perceptions of reality are not all the same. And all these people that had these meta narratives saying this is how you make sense of the world, whether they're governments or like churches in Europe that told everybody to go off to war and that their God was going to make their country win because their God loved them more than the other people right next door to them. And then nobody won the war, and it was just horrible, and everybody got, you know, so many millions of people died. That's the moment that Europe really starts to secularize. Not in an intentional way even. People just give up. They're like, oh, this isn't true. All these things that you guys were saying, they're not true about life. And we're seeing just how absurd our sane societies with all these, you know, rational leaders are. This is crazy. And people were like, this is madness. People should have stopped this like in August of 1914 after the first machine guns were fired into people trying to march like they did in the Civil War into stuff. This is this is madness. But we didn't stop it. We just amped it up and built new weapons and made bigger contracts with industrialists. And so the folks in the 1920s are like, this is not a pipe. This is not a government. This is not a rational government. We're not dealing with what we're saying is not matching up with the imagery. And that's reflected in like some of these other artists that are so that is a representation of what is called Dadaism, which comes out in the 1920s. And here's a portrait by Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp. He's one of the Dadaists, and he painted that. He painted the most Mona Lisa, like, and then he painted a little goatee on her, which is so weird to think about. Like, dude, you could paint that. I mean, that's pretty damn good. Picasso could draw a perfect circle freehand. Like, they're called masters because they had the chops. They just didn't care about trying to play that game with that high society of art. They're like, your value systems are wretched. They're stupid. They don't make any sense. This is a farce. You guys trying to say that we're like a, civil society is not true. And so more and more of the Dadaist art looks like, collages of things that are that don't go together. They're kind of weird together. They don't really make sense, like here, or they look like not Thomas Kincaid. That's certainly not true. I have a picture up of it. It's like performance art. They're making pieces of art as well as performing it, as well as creating like static art. So like this urinal that is on the floor with a spigot going out to nowhere, like this mannequin head right here with all these strange, technological gadgets attached to it. Or this one, which is probably one of the most famous ones, an iron with like nails coming out of the steam hole. And it's just like, okay, if we thought there was no rules with Picasso, like we're entering another dimension here with this kind of art. And then of course, like the epitome of this art, kind of like with Impressionism, in my opinion at least, is, and one of my favorite artists is Salvador Dali. And everybody knows him too, even if you don't know the name, or you've heard the name but you didn't connect it to it. He does these trippy pictures like this of, clocks melting, or like elephants and horses having these crazy long legs, and like, there's like a naked kind of maybe Christ figure here, but that looks like, I don't know. These are elephants. That looks like a Greek goddess. This is like a temple of some sorts. Maybe both of those are. It doesn't have a genre. That's what he looked like too. He's crazy guy. But he was very unique. This is just kind of him, the way Van Gogh was just Van Gogh. But you can see with Dali, it's like, oh, that looks like one of the Dadaist paintings or collages, but it's much more three-dimensional, and he looks even more like he was on mushrooms when he was painting these things, right? Like, these are crazy and trippy. And so then at this point, the end of the 20s and 30s, moving into the 40s, I think, art becomes very surreal and cerebral, which is a necessary step before you get to something like Star Wars or the Avengers. Like, those movies are never going to be created without those things happening. And at the same time, somebody like J.R.R. Tolkien, making the genre of fantasy, which didn't exist before right then. And somebody like Stan Lee making comic books that are just beginning at that time too, right? Like, okay, the Avengers thing that's hot right now, it all's starting right in here. This is where films and studios are really kind of stepping into sound and color film. Like, okay, there's a big transition happening in the art world. Pop culture is really taking off. People are listening to radio shows and reading comic books and pulp fiction, and there's this whole other artistic element to society that wasn't really a category before you had mass media for folks. And so after the war, after World War II, when everything's even more absurd than it was during World War I, is when you get Jackson Pollock. And this is
Professor?
like, yeah.
So you would say that the artist Rene Magritte, it's surrealism or surrealism? How do you say that
Surrealism, yeah, like it's surreal.
word? Surrealism?
Surrealism. So Salvador Dali, yeah, he's surrealism, which is kind of like to me is like, okay, this is the next step from Dadaism, which was really trying to just be absurd, still with reality things. He just goes absurd and kind of just bends the reality the way Picasso was. And
So
then
same thing with Rene Magritte, with the one with the pipe.
yeah, Henri Matisse, with the like those kind of flowers or the dancing, yeah, with the dancing beasts.
Okay.
And then after the war, Jackson Pollock's probably going to be one of the most influential artists, and his paintings are like this. He pours oil and splats oil on canvas. And again, you're like, well, any kindergartner could do that. But then on second examination, you're like, okay, well, this is actually quite stunning contrasts in 3 or 4 simple shades. And there does look like there's some actually like motive, at least, in what he's doing, where my kindergartners they can't even draw this kid, like my own kids. So yeah, anybody could throw paint on a canvas. Not anybody can do that and actually force the world to take it seriously and then set some trends and patterns. So this is like abstract art is what this is called. It's just like, what? This is art? It's just paint on a canvas. Like nobody even drew anything. Yeah. What do you think about when you look at it? Well, I don't know. Like, just stare at it a little bit. And what do you feel? What do you think? Okay, well, that's the point of the art. No, but what am I supposed to feel and think about it? No, that's not a thing. Like, this art is not telling you what to do or how to be. You just get to interpret it, and your interpretation is like one of those shades around cubism, the way Picasso was running. And so then when it gets to this level of absurdity, it kind of resets and goes back to reality, like making realistic images. And that's what we call pop art. So this is Lichtenstein. You might have seen these kinds of bubble. They're very popular now. I had some of these prints in my office like 15 years ago because I really dug these, and I'm glad they're popular. They're cool looking. He had cool art, and there were like little frames like a comic book, but there's no story. It's like 1 or 2 or maybe 3 frames next to each other that go together. They're saying something, but it's not cohesive. You can't get what the point of it is. It's evoking something. And then, so he's one, and that's kind of along the lines of comic book art. And then Andy Warhol does something like this. He comes along with pop art and does like the Campbell's soup can, which, if you remember in our notes, you guys, it's in your notes. I saw you put it in there in the exhibition in 1900 in Paris is when Campbell's soup premieres, which is a very telling symbol of modernity, especially if you think about the traditional place food and cooking has held in families transculturally, right? Globally, not just in one culture, all cultures. That's been a very important part of culture since humans have been cooking food and not just eating things they find on the ground and in trees. Now, nobody really has to cook anything. You literally just crack a can open and heat it up in a pot. Like any guy can do that. Like, that's weird for us to think about, but there really used to be such a disconnect with genders, especially at this point, that in some ways, women's role and value in like the economy of the home gets even lessened. And ironically, what's going to happen, and you know, as Campbell's soup comes out, and then as all these like, you know, vacuum cleaners and things come out that are supposed to save us time, uh, we actually just get busier. So when the vacuum cleaner comes out, it does save women or house cleaners time, but it also just raises levels of cleanliness and then expectations and then more chores and often more gizmos to go with that and a busier and busier life. So by the time we get to like the 60s, the Campbell's soup can has meant different things to different generations. And it's also incredibly ordinary. There's nothing, you know, extraordinary about it, but it's an icon of America, the kind of way the Coke bottle is, kind of the way Marilyn Monroe was at the time, or Mickey Mouse, or, you know, any of these. The bandana isn't really, but you know, Andy Warhol's a weird guy.
I think it was the Velvet Underground that used the banana picture.
Yes, he kind of actually formed the Velvet Underground. He got Lou Reed and was kind of their, I don't know, like producer, manager, I think, at least in the beginning. But yeah, so and they used that banana picture. You can see that one right back there.
Like,
So then, you know, so then from there, like art obviously continues to morph, and there's all kinds of new categories always. Digital art is a whole thing now. It was not in the 60s, it didn't exist. So new technologies, new changes in our society reflect our art, and our art reflects, you know, our values. So I find it helpful, even if you don't enjoy the art, to know where it goes in the timeline. And then you can go, well, I don't care if I like it or not. I get what it is saying. Or I could ask, what is this saying? And even come to my own conclusions about what's going on in society and what I think about that art piece. Because especially as we, you know, move into kind of after realism into surrealism, it's not about the point of the art. It's about the
Why
experience
was
of it.
the art created in that era? What it
Yeah,
represents.
yeah, exactly. So this is just a very helpful way for us to access history that for me was very unnatural. I had no experience or kind of even understanding of how to do that. But film did, like that made a little bit more sense to me. And that's also a really helpful way once you get film to be able to interpret history. So that's like a longer, you know, that was almost an hour probably of we took a detour with COVID, but of explaining it like a 60,000-foot view, kind of art and its trajectory and what's that pointing us to as we are, you know, moving into the 20th century now. So, okay, let's take a 5-minute break. Oh, let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 8:05. The class ends at 9:05. So we'll come back in 10 minutes and hit it hard for kind of moving through the next chapter or two in material at like a 60,000-foot view. Okay,